Alright guys, so let's talk about the world breaking apart. Let's talk about de-globalization. And this is going to be your financial apocalypse update. So things aren't going well for Europe. Germany in particular is facing a major industrial collapse. Now we saw what happened with Volkswagen. They are Germany's largest private employer. And because they can't compete globally anymore, over 15,000 jobs could be at risk. While Europe's auto industry is collapsing, they are banking everything on semiconductors. They're at the poker table and they're pushing all the chips virtually on chips. By now, we know the West is waging a big war with China over semiconductors, and the plan is simple: build the most advanced chips in the G7 countries, keep innovation away from Beijing, and make semiconductors in the West for the Western markets. And to make this happen, Europe created their own CHIPS Act, a big pile of subsidies to lure semiconductor giants like Intel into the bloc.
In total, more than 43 billion euros of public investment, both European Union and national level investment, will support the CHIPS Act until 2030. It will make Europe a more attractive place for tech companies to invest in cutting-edge chips development and production. And this is why I see today's announcement by Intel as a first major achievement under the EU CHIPS Act. An 80 billion euros investment over the next decade across the entire semiconductor value chain.
Now, this was back in 2022. Von der Leyen expected Intel to set up shop in the EU, but that might not even happen now. The original plan was to get Intel to build a factory in Germany worth over 30 billion euros. But Intel just freezed everything. They will delay the construction of their German plant by 2 years. Now, this isn't good because Germany is desperate. Their entire economy is in decline, especially their industries. They need the investment from Intel now to create new manufacturing jobs. Germany needs this show of strength that the country is still an industrial hub. So Intel's big delay is a slap to the face. This is confirmation that even their allies don't find Germany an attractive place to make stuff. Even the EU CHIPS Act isn't enough to lure companies in. Intel is willing to forgo 10 billion euros in subsidies from Germany. That means a third to half of the entire plant will come from government money. Even that incentive isn't enough to get Intel to build the factory. The EU has a very ambitious plan. They want to produce a fifth of the world's semiconductors by 2030 in just 6 years. This sounds great, but we know it's quite impossible. The writing was on the wall when Germany lost cheap gas from Russia. Now, if Intel is already facing massive layoffs in the US, the last place they want to shift production to is Europe, especially Germany. The operating costs there are just unthinkable. We said many times that America's agenda is reshoring and not really friendshoring. If companies can make chips back in the US where demand is much higher and production costs are slightly lower, why make them in Europe? This is the cost of manufacturing in Germany. In 2019, power costs were around 38 euros per megawatt hour. Today in 2024, it's almost double at 68 euros. Even if you throw in the $10 billion in subsidies, the operating costs just don't make sense. Intel will be digging themselves into a bigger ditch, and it's not guaranteed they can recoup their investment. Now, the issue here was never about the EU CHIPS Act. Subsidies are not a blanket solution. The German economy isn't geared towards manufacturing anymore. The most obvious avenues for cheap energy have been shut off by the Germans themselves. Firstly, nuclear power plants are not coming back online. The Greens just won't allow it. Germany also has access to Nord Stream 2. That hasn't been blown up, it's fully operational. If the Germans still wants to access Russian gas, it's very possible. You can pump in 55 billion cubic meters of natural gas annually. That alone will be a game changer. It will U-turn Germany's deindustrialization, but we kind of know it's politically impossible today. Olaf Scholz knows this very well. He needs to find alternatives and he has to do it quickly, or Made in Germany will be in history books. In a very bizarre move, he's visiting Central Asia, heading all the way to Kazakhstan to build energy ties, basically to bring in more affordable oil and gas into Germany. But there are two big challenges with this economic push. While the country is a big gas producer, they aren't a big giant like Russia. In terms of gas reserves, they're only ranked 12 on the list, so the ability to ramp up production just for Germany is quite limited. Besides, the majority of their exports goes to China. Beijing is not going to give them up. The bigger reason is the relation they have with Russia. The country is part of the old Soviet bloc, the Soviet era. They are a strong ally of Russia and they want to join BRICS as well. So Germany might be knocking on the wrong door here. But let's assume that Scholz signs a gas deal with Kazakhstan. There's still a big logistic problem. Their gas exports goes through the Central Asia Pipeline System or the CAC. And this pipeline cuts through Russian territory, which obviously means Moscow has a say if the supply can reach Germany or not. And the same goes for the oil supply. It goes through the Druzhba pipeline, which crosses over Russia as well. So the big test for Germany and for Europe as a semiconductor hub is the TSMC plant, the Taiwanese chip giant. The EU is giving 5 billion euros for building the factory in Dresden. But will this work? We just need to look at their Arizona plant in the US. There's already a culture clash between Taiwanese and US workers there. Even the founder of TSMC, Maurice Chang, complained about American work culture many years back. Making chips is very expensive. The machines have to run non-stop to justify the cost. If the machines break down at 1 in the morning, the US will only fix them the next morning. But in Taiwan, it will be fixed at 2 a.m. If this is the situation in the US, it's going to be worse in Germany. Of all the G7 countries, American workers are more competitive and they work longer hours. In the EU, however, we all know this, it's all about work-life balance. There's no way they can live up to Taiwanese standards, but that's just the work culture. In manufacturing, it all comes down to the cost of production. Semiconductor giants like Intel and TSMC, they have to manufacture where it makes sense. As companies under the Western umbrella, manufacturing in China is impossible, at least for the most advanced chips, the 7 nanometers and better. In the US, production is already a big challenge. If you shift production to the US, the cost of chips could double. And when the cost goes up, the pervasiveness of chips will stop or slow down considerably. In other words, fewer products will use the most advanced semiconductors. The price of everything from phones to computers could go up, and that would in turn hurt revenue and slow innovation down. The US business model in semiconductors is to stay 5 to 10 years ahead of China. But if the chips are too expensive, they'll be non-competitive in the global market, and that would in fact give China more allowance to play catch up. Instead of 5 to 10 years, Beijing could close the gap in half that time. In June, Intel told the world that China's chip market is irreplaceable. The demand there is just too big. As a private company, Intel will continue to build products for the Chinese market. China accounts for 50% of global chip consumption. Every company, including Nvidia, still relies on Chinese revenue to grow their bottom line. Take Qualcomm for example. This is a giant chipmaker in the US, and guess what? 60% of their revenue comes from one single country, China. If that's the case, what's the point of making chips in the EU? You might as well just make them back in the US and export them directly to the Chinese market. You'll protect your margins with fewer investment risks. So Europe's ambition of being this big semiconductor hub just won't work. It's gonna fail. It's not even a dream, it's more of a desperate fantasy. While EU manufacturing is in trouble, von der Leyen, well, she's busy giving money to Ukraine. And we must talk about this. The future of Europe's financial industry doesn't look promising as well. Von der Leyen has announced a mega loan of 35 billion euros to Ukraine. This is a very big amount of money to give. Now, it's one thing if the money comes from the ECB or EU members, but the $35 billion is backed by Russia's frozen assets. And you can bet that this is only going to be the start. As the months and as the years go by, the bigger amounts will get drawn down.
I am happy to announce that today the Commission has adopted proposals that will enable the European Union to lend 35 billion euros from the G7 pledge. This is a huge step forward. We are now confident that we can deliver this loan to Ukraine very quickly, a loan that is backed by the windfall profits from immobilized Russian assets.
So the money will be injected directly into Ukraine's budget, and if they default on the loan, which the risk is quite high, I would assume, it will be Russia that foots the bill. The amount will be drawn from the frozen reserves. And this is very, very risky to say the least. The G7 might have agreed to the seizure, but it's Europe that's weaponizing Russia's assets first. Even the US isn't doing that at such a large scale yet. Even Christine Lagarde, the head of the ECB, says this is a crazy idea. Trying to raise debt against the Russian assets carries quite a bit of legal risk. And this will break the world order the West says they want to uphold. So there's an enormous contradiction here. Von der Leyen is definitely no Christine Lagarde. She doesn't understand the big implications this will have on the EU financial system. This will ironically help the US more than the EU. In terms of the frozen Russian assets, there's a huge asymmetry between the location of the assets. Only 6 billion is in the US while over 200 billion is in the Eurozone. The level of exposure is much higher for Europe. Lagarde also pointed out the weakness of the euro versus the dollar. The USD is the world's reserve currency, but the euro isn't, so this seizure will hurt the euro even more. However, that's just the economic cost. There's also the risk of a big diplomatic disaster. This will make peace in Europe even harder to achieve. And it's a peace that the EU desperately needs to revive their economy. Eventually, the West and Russia, they'll all meet at the negotiating table. If you pledge all of Russia's assets for loans to Ukraine, what do you have left? A big bargaining chip is gone. Now, I'm not saying that Russia is desperate to get the money back, but it's still a point of contention. It will be brought up in discussions 100%. What if Putin wants the money back? Where are you going to conjure $300 billion from? These are serious questions that the EU leaders aren't thinking about. So Europe is in this big limbo, is bad decision after bad decision. Throwing billions in subsidies isn't enough to make Europe a semiconductor hub. The cost of manufacturing just doesn't make sense. Using the Russian reserves might feel good, but you're risking the entire financial system. But I guess there's no turning back anymore. But let me know what you think. Can the EU revive their industries? And will Russia demand their money back from the West? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.